Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the School Meals Zoom training, part 1. It's a pleasure to have all of you joining us, and we will go ahead and get started with today's presentation. Your presenters for today are myself, Sean Von Drachek. I have Erica Erder joining us and Allie Lampman. If you would like to see a complete directory of the nutrition services staff, it can be found on the last page of your handout packet. Next slide. We ask that you use the chat box for your questions. We will not be answering these during the presentation, but we will answer them all at the end of the presentation. You will be muted during the presentation, but unmuted during question and answer time. Next slide. The slide deck and handouts have been emailed to you, and they are also posted on the Nutrition Services website. We will review the handout packet in the order of the packet. We have part 1, part 2, and part 3 of our Zoom training, all included in the handout packet.
See down here where it says start.
Training certificate for today is in your packet. It's the first page of your handout packet. Next slide. And we're using an honor system for our training certificate. If you stay until the end of the presentation, it is 3 hours of continuing education credit. And if you need to jump off anytime during the presentation, record the number of hours that you actually view the presentation. So there is a training certificate for part 1, part 2, and part 3. And we ask that you stay till the end, because we're going to be covering a lot of important information during each part of our training. And today is part 1. Next slide. Our goal after training is that you will be able to plan lunch and breakfast menus that meet the USDA meal pattern requirements, and that you're able to identify reimbursable meals. Next slide. So let's start. For those of you that are new to the world of the School Meals program, we want to kind of explain why your school or organization is participating in the program. You receive reimbursement for the meals served to your students. School food authorities, and we refer to those as SFAs, that's an important acronym to keep in mind, is that as a school food authority, you must adhere to the rules and regulations of the school meals program in order to receive federal dollars. So we're providing training on what those rules and regulations are. So USDA provides federal dollars in the form of reimbursement for meals served in schools. Well, that money is funneled down to the state agency, and the Nebraska Department of Education Nutrition Services is the state agency that distributes these dollars. Next slide. In order to receive those dollars, schools and institutions are required to meet federal regulations to receive those funds. Well, so after we train you on the rules and regulations, then our agency, the state agency, Nutrition Services staff, conduct what's called administrative reviews. And those are often referred to as ARs. We also conduct procurement reviews called PRs, and lots of acronyms in our program. Administrative reviews and procurement reviews are conducted to ensure that our schools and institutions are in compliance with the rules and regulations of the program. Well, we all know that we've experienced some unique times in the last couple of years, and due to COVID-19, we would normally be following a 5-year review cycle for conducting the administrative reviews and procurement reviews, but because we were operating some different programs during that time, our 5-year review cycle has been extended. And with that extension, we didn't conduct reviews in school year 2021 because our schools and institutions were operating the summer food service program, and it had its own set of reviews. And then in 21-22, we were operating the seamless summer option under the school meals pattern, and we did a limited number of reviews during that time. So our review cycle was extended to 7 years. So we are currently starting year 3 of our review cycle, and we will be conducting reviews like we did last year. We were back to pretty much normal last year. And you will be notified in the fall if you will be having an administrative or procurement review in school year 23-24. So just be aware that we provide lots of notification ahead of time for those reviews, several months to get prepared for those reviews. So we will be letting you know in the fall if you will be having an administrative or procurement review this upcoming school year. Next slide. So what do you need to know for school year 23-24? Well, meals are reimbursed by student eligibility. They're reimbursed by free eligibility, reduced eligibility, and then for those students that do not qualify for free or reduced, paid eligibility. The reimbursement rates for school year 23-24 were released on July 7th, and they are posted on the Nutrition Services website, and they are also included in your handout packet. You can find the reimbursement rates on the Nutrition Services website under Quick Links. And so let's talk a little bit about the reimbursement rates. There's different layers of reimbursement. There's the standard rate of reimbursement for free, reduced, and paid. And then USDA has an extra layer of reimbursement called the performance-based incentive. And that's that additional 8 cents is added on to the normal reimbursement rates for meeting the vegetable subgroups and whole grain rich requirements. That extra layer of reimbursement can be turned off if your school is found not to be in compliance with those menu planning requirements. So there's the normal rate of reimbursement plus there's the additional rate of reimbursement. And so it's very important that schools are in compliance with all of the meal pattern requirements, including the vegetable subgroups and whole grain rich requirements. Next slide. So let's dive into what's required. This is a food program with meal pattern requirements, breakfast meal pattern requirements, after school snack meal pattern requirements, and pre-K meal pattern requirements. So we're going to jump into the lunch meal pattern right now. So let's move to the next slide. In your handout packet, you will see the meal pattern requirements for lunch. And we can see that we have food components, we have required grade groups. So let's move to the next slide. As you look at your handout packet, you're going to see that there are different food groups, and these are called components in the school meals pattern. So food groups are called components, food components that are required to be served. You can also look across and see there are required portion sizes that are based on specific grade groups. And so as you look at your handout packet, you can see that there is K through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12 portion size requirements. Menus must also meet USDA nutrient standards, and those are listed at the bottom of the handout for the lunch meal pattern. So it's very important that we understand that we have required food components and we have required portion sizes that have to be met. Failure to meet meal pattern requirements may result in non-reimbursable meals. So if you don't meet the meal pattern requirements, then and that's found during a review, then those meals aren't reimbursable. Next slide. So let's talk about the meal components, the food components that are required to be served. We have meat alternate, we have fruits, we have vegetables, we have grains, and we have milk. We have 5 food components. When I look at menus, I look for those 5 food components on production records and on your calendar style menu. So let's review those one more time. We're looking for meat alternate, fruits, vegetables, grains, and milk. All of those food components are required at lunch. Moving on to the next slide. So what are the required grade groups? We've already talked about that briefly. Grades K through 5, grades 6 through 8, grades 9 through 12. And then if you look at your chart, you're going to see that the meal pattern portion sizes for K through 5 and 6 through 8, the daily requirements are the same. So there's an overlap. But when we look at the weekly requirements for K through 5, 6 through 8, there's one difference. And that one difference is the 6 through 8 are required to have a minimum of 9 ounces of meat alternate. So we can plan menus that overlap for K through 8. The portion sizes are minimum requirements. So that makes it easier for a menu planner to plan menus for K through 8. Let's move to the next slide. So let's talk about the meat alternate. The daily requirement for K through 5, 6 through 8 is 1 ounce equivalent minimum cooked weight per day. The daily requirement for 9 through 12 is 2 ounces equivalent minimum cooked per day. So there's a big difference between K through 8 and 9 through 12. We have 1 ounce for K through 8. We have 2 ounces per day for 9 through 12. But let's look at that weekly requirement. We have 8 for K through 5, 6 through 8 grades, 9. And then for 9 through 12, we have 10. So that's a minimum that you have to plan for. So I can't plan for just 1 ounce per day for K through 8 because I also have a weekly requirement that has to be met. And this is for each entree choice that I would offer. So if I'm offering multiple choices of entrees per week, I have to meet that weekly requirement. So the Uncrustable sandwiches, let's use that as an example. The small ones that many schools utilize, those credit as 1 ounce meat alternate and 1 ounce of grain. If I would serve that by itself as an entree option, I would meet the daily requirement, but I would not meet the weekly requirement, because if that was my entree choice at the end of 5 days, I would only have 5 ounces of meat alternate. So I would need to supplement that with an additional ounce of meat alternate. And many schools do that by offering either the 4-ounce container of yogurt or a cheese stick to meet that requirement. Now, remember, these are minimums I can go over. So if I offer the Uncrustable with a cheese stick every day, I would meet the daily and weekly requirement, because I would have 10 ounces at the end of the 5-day week. Now, it's important that I stress that the 9 through 12 grades, it's 2 ounces per day that they have to be offered. That's sometimes an area that has caused some problems when we have went out on reviews, is that we're not meeting that 2 ounces per day for 9 through 12. Let's move to the next slide. So meat alternate must be served in the main dish or the main dish and one other menu item. So for example, like my Uncrustable with the cheese stick, main dish plus one other item. For districts not offering entree choices, the same form of meat should not be served more than 3 times a week. So if you're not offering entree choices and you have a single entree choice, then I can't serve chicken 5 days a week. I need to have variety in my menus. So I can only offer a chicken product 3 days a week. So that's important also. If you're not offering entree choices, we would encourage you to offer entree choices. Everyone likes choices when at mealtime, and it's pretty easy to offer some simple entree choices. But if you are not, just keep that in mind, that the same form of meat should not be served more than 3 times per week. Next slide. So what are some examples of meat alternate? Meats, poultry, seafood, cheese, yogurt, eggs. Those are all meat alternates. Nuts and seeds cannot exceed 50% of the daily requirement. Dried beans and peas credit as a meat alternate or as a vegetable, but cannot credit as both in the same meal. So for example, if I'm serving chili, which has ground beef and beans of some form in it, either I'm going to credit those beans towards the meat alternate requirement, or I'm going to credit them towards the vegetable requirement for the vegetable subgroup, the dried bean category. I can't credit them as both. It's either meat alternate or as the vegetable. Tofu and soy yogurt can be served. And at one of our trainings, I asked if anybody had ever served tofu, and I had a hand raised that they tried it last year because it was a student request. It's something we typically don't see, but the meal pattern is for all schools nationwide. So we're talking from the East Coast to the West Coast, and where we're in the Midwest, some of these items may not be something we see on menus, but on the coast or at other regions, they may be popular on school menus. Next slide. So how do things credit? cheese. 1 ounce of cheese equals 1 ounce of meat alternate. Dried beans and peas, 1/4 cup equals 1 ounce. Cottage cheese, 1/4 cup equals 1 ounce. Eggs, a large egg equals 2 ounces of meat alternate. Peanut butter, 2 tablespoons of peanut butter equals 1 ounce. So if you're making your own peanut butter sandwiches, keep that in mind, that 2 tablespoons equal 1 ounce. Now, if I'm making sandwiches for my high school students and the daily requirement is 2 ounces, I would need to have 4 tablespoons of peanut butter on that sandwich, unless I was menuing it with another meat alternate. That's a lot of peanut butter on a sandwich. But once again, at one of our live trainings, I asked that same question, and we had 2 schools that raised their hand that they make their peanut butter sandwiches with 4 tablespoons of peanut butter. Yogurt, 4 fluid ounces or a 1/2 cup equals 1 ounce. And tofu, 2.2 ounces or a 1/4 cup equals 1 ounce. So what doesn't count? What are non-creditable items? Bacon, unless it's turkey bacon. Canned chicken noodle soup. Imitation cheese. Commercial non-commodity cheese sauces or powdered mixes. So those things don't credit towards the meat alternate. They can occasionally be served, but with that, we need to keep some other things in mind with serving those non-creditable items. And those things would be, well, cost. It's added cost to your menus. Plus, those items typically are high in sodium. And when we talk about nutrient standards in the school meal pattern, we always have to keep in mind, we've got nutrient standards. We have a sodium requirement, and those items tend to be higher in sodium. So serving them very infrequently is a good idea, because they're high in sodium and they can put you over for your weekly requirements for sodium. Next slide. Let's move to the fruit requirement. Well, the daily requirement for K through 8 is a 1/2 cup. For 9 through 12, the requirement is 1 cup. Weekly requirements is just the daily times 5 days in a week, which would be 2.5 cups for our K through 8 grade students and 5 cups for 9 through 12. Now, many schools have wonderful fruit and vegetable bars. And so you're offering your students a variety of different fruits on the bar, and they can take what they choose. You're offering it to them, and they can choose. So you are meeting the daily and weekly requirement. If you do not have a fruit and vegetable bar where students can self-serve themselves, then you need to make sure as a menu planner, it's on your menu that you are serving a 1/2 cup for K through 8 and 1 cup for 9 through 12. Next slide. So what counts? Well, fruit can be canned in juice or light syrup. 100% fruit juice can be served. No more than half of the fruit offering over the week may be in the form of juice. So keep that in mind. A 1/4 cup of dried fruit equals a 1/2 cup of fruit. So in the dried form, like for example, raisins, if I would serve a 1/4 cup of raisins, that is equivalent to a 1/2 cup of fruit. The minimum serving size to credit is 1/8 of a cup. Next slide. So fruits continued. Let's talk about snack type fruit products. do not credit towards a reimbursable meal. And so examples of that would be our fruit leathers, our fruit shapes, and fruit has to be in the form that students can recognize that it is a fruit. So that's a requirement. So it has to be in the form where students can tell that, yes, that is a fruit. So for example, raisins. Well, students can recognize raisins are grapes, okay, dried grapes. So that's why that's okay. But when it's in the form of a fruit leather or fruit shapes, it can still be sold. It just doesn't count as a fruit requirement under the meal program. So you can still sell it. It just doesn't count credit as the fruit component. Next slide. We're going to move on to the vegetable group. So we've got the vegetable component, and the daily requirement is 3/4 cup for K through 8. So I have to plan for that on my menus, 3/4 cup. And then for 9 through 12, it's 1 cup that has to be planned for on menus. I have my weekly requirement, which is just my daily times 5 days in the school week. So 3 3/4 cup for K through 8, and for 9 through 12, 5 cups. Once again, if I have a fruit vegetable bar and I'm offering it to my students and they're self-selecting, self-serving themselves, I'm meeting this requirement because they can take 3/4 cup if they're K through 8. They can take 1 cup if they're 9 through 12. They can take more if they want on a self-serve fruit and vegetable bar. Next slide. Vegetables. 100% vegetable juice may be served. Canned soups that are vegetable based, like my cream of tomato soup or my tomato soup, a 1 cup serving equals a 4th cup vegetable credit unless it is labeled differently. It has a CN label, a child nutrition label, or there's labeling that indicates how it contributes to meeting the meal pattern. So I know there's some soups out there that 1 cup equals a 1/2 cup of vegetable credit. But without that labeling, then 1 cup serving equals a 4th cup vegetable. Cooked dried beans and peas may count as a meat alternate or as a vegetable, but not both. We've already talked about that. You can't credit them as a meat alternate and a vegetable. You have to make the decision how you're going to credit those. The minimum serving size to credit is a 4th cup, or I'm sorry, an 1/8 cup. So the minimum serving size to credit is an 1/8 cup. Next slide. So now let's dive into the vegetable subgroups. We know we have the daily requirement of 3/4 cup for K through 8, and we have the daily requirement of 1 cup for 9 through 12. Now we have weekly vegetable subgroups that have to be met. There's no daily requirement, but during the course of the week, I have to serve these vegetable subgroups in the required portion size. And so we have the dark green, we have the red orange, we have the dried bean pea requirement, we have starchy vegetables, we have the other category. And as you look at your handout, you can see we have additional category, and that additional is, it can be any of those other vegetable subgroups because we have to meet that weekly requirement. And so we can serve any of the others to reach that additional. So let's move to the next slide and talk more about the dark green vegetable subgroups. So as I plan my menus for K through 12, I have to ensure that I'm offering at least a half a cup per week of the dark green category. Now, the dark green category would include our broccoli, our romaine, our fresh spinach or canned spinach, our dark green. Next slide. So for green, dark green leafy, it credits at half the volume. So for example, 1 cup of romaine lettuce equals a half a cup of vegetable. Because of the volume, the leafiness of the green, it only credits as half the amount. So 1 cup equals a half a cup. And that's an important point to make note of. I've seen on menus where that hasn't been taken into account, that it takes twice the volume to equal the half cup. So 1 cup equals a half a cup of vegetable. Now, if it's cooked, leafy greens are equal to the volume served. And I doubt very many of you probably have cooked spinach on your menu, but remember this meal pattern is nationwide. And so probably in some regions, there are cooked greens on menus. And so if it's cooked, it equals the same. So a half a cup cooked would equal a half a cup of vegetable. Next slide. Let's move to the red-orange subgroup. So the portion size for grades K through 8, I have to plan for 3/4 cup per week for K through 8. And for 9 through 12, I have to plan for 1 1/4 cup per week. Once again, if I'm offering your fruit vegetable bar and I've got tomatoes, baby carrots on that bar, I'm going to meet that requirement. But if I do not have a fruit vegetable bar and I'm serving these items, I need to plan for those weekly requirements. So examples of the red and orange would be our tomatoes, our carrots, our sweet potatoes, like sweet potato fries, red peppers fall into this category. Next slide. Let's move to the dried beans and pea category. So we're talking about, these are like our beans and peas. They're from the dried state and then they're reconstituted. So they have to be from that dried state. The portion size for K through 12 is a half a cup per week. Now, in your handout packet, there's a list of all the vegetable subgroups. So as you look at that list, you can see what falls into the dried bean pea category. This group is also known as legumes. So examples of dried beans and peas would be like our vegetarian beans, our kidney beans, our navy beans, pinto, refried beans, split peas, our garbanzo beans, our baked beans. Now, this is sometimes a difficult subgroup to meet. And I've seen menus where baked beans are on the menu every week. But there's a lot of different types of dried beans that can be on your menus, like the refried beans. If you have a fruit vegetable bar, that's a good way to offer your dried beans, peas. Put some black beans out on your bar. Make your own cowboy salsa with black beans and corn and tomatoes. You can also do the garbanzo beans, either from the can, or some schools utilize the garbanzo beans where they drain them very well, coat them with oil, and put some seasoning on them. Of course, low sodium seasoning or salt-free seasoning, and bake them in an oven. And then they become crunchy. And you can put those on your bar, and that would meet the requirement. So lots of different ways to offer the dried beans peas. But just keep in mind, if you don't have a fruit vegetable bar and you're serving your dried beans and peas, the requirement is a half a cup per week. Next slide. We've got our starchy subgroup category, and the portion size for K through 12 is a half a cup per week. Now, this is probably a pretty easy subgroup to meet because we've got our potatoes in this category, and our students really like their French fries, their tater tots. Corn, peas fall into this category, so a little easier to meet the half cup requirement. Let's move to the next slide. Then we have our other subgroup, and our other subgroup would be all those other vegetables that don't fall into the other categories, like our cabbage, our green beans, cucumbers, our iceberg lettuce. Iceberg lettuce is not a dark green vegetable. It falls in the other category. Mushrooms, those types of things would be in the other category. And the weekly requirement for K through 8 is a half a cup. And then for 9 through 12, it's 3/4 cup. So we've got to make sure that we're offering a variety of different vegetables to our students. Next slide. So let's talk about those mixed vegetables, like our classic mixed vegetable that sometimes schools serve. There's just too many vegetables in our classic mixed vegetable blend to credit in any one category. And so it would be under the other category, vegetable subgroup category, other. Our California blend vegetable, which has our cauliflower, carrots, broccoli. We have our 3-way mix. Then a 3/4 cup serving would provide a 1/4 cup of red, because we have our carrots, a 1/4 cup of dark green, we have our broccoli, and then our cauliflower would be under the other category. Next slide. Fruit and vegetable bars, I've mentioned that numerous times. It's just a great way to get in our requirements for our fruit and vegetables. It's an easy way to meet all of those subgroups. Offering choices increases customer satisfaction and consumption, that there's a variety of different fruits and vegetables to choose from. And certainly, hopefully, our students can find something from the bar that they will eat. It certainly helps meet the weekly subgroup requirements, and it, they're so attractive. Just a great way to offer our students a variety of different fruits and vegetables. Next slide. Now, the form that items are provided. We all know that our students are experiencing all kinds of different dental issues that we need to be aware of, and mealtime is often very limited. The School Nutrition Association recommends that students have at least 20 minutes at the table to eat. And I know many schools probably aren't able to provide that much time. It might be 20 minutes from the time they enter the serving line till they need to leave, but the School Nutrition Association recommends 20 minutes at the table. And we certainly want to provide food in the form that students can eat. We know that many elementary students are missing teeth. We've got braces going on. So cut versus whole fresh fruits. It's a lot easier to eat apple wedges than it is to bite into an apple if you don't have front teeth. And then we encourage the fruit and vegetable bars for all ages. It's a great way for students to meet the requirements, to self-select what they're going to eat. Some schools offer all you can eat fruit and vegetable bars. And if you do that, then you want to make sure that you have clean, that they shouldn't be returning to the bar with their tray. We don't want cross-contamination. So we want to make sure that if they do come back to the bar, that plates or boats are available for them to get a second serving of fruit and vegetables. So make sure that you're taking that into consideration. And, you know, a lot of schools think, well, our students are too little to make up their mind. But with assistance, any student can select from a fruit and vegetable bar. You can see in the picture that's on the slide that we've got some little students that are taking advantage of self-serving themselves from the fruit and vegetable bar. And there's a little riser by the bar so students can stand on that to serve themselves. So a lot of schools have come up with some ingenious ways to offer fruit and vegetable bars to their younger students. Next slide. If you're unable to offer a fruit and vegetable bar, consider pre-portioning for self-service. Look at these beautiful pictures of varieties of fruits and vegetables that have been pre-portioned for students to select from. They're still able to have choices. They're pre-portioned. Students can grab them as they leave the serving line. And it's a great way still to meet our fruit and vegetable requirement because we're offering it to our students and they're able to self-select what they intend on eating.
I'm going to go ahead and get started with grains. Now, grains, we are still on the lunch meal pattern, so we're still in lunch. And grains, just like your meat alternate, also have a daily and weekly requirement that you need to meet. For grains, we refer to those as ounce equivalents. So for grades K through 5 and grades 6 through 8, the daily requirement is 1 ounce equivalent minimum for grains. And then grades 9 through 12 have a 2 ounce equivalent minimum daily for grains. The weekly requirement for grades K through 5 and 6 through 8 is 8 ounce equivalents of grains per week. And for grades 9 through 12, they have a 10 ounce equivalent of grains per week that at minimum need to be met. Now, these weekly requirements are based on a 5-day week. So just kind of like Sean talked about with the meat alternates, if you're only offering grades K through 5 and 6 through 8 a 1 ounce equivalent minimum daily, by the end of your 5-day week, you would not be meeting that 8 ounce equivalent weekly. So really you have to offer more than 1 ounce per day, or if there's a day you only offer 1 ounce, then you need to make sure you offer more throughout the week in order to make those weekly requirements as well. Because when we come to do an administrative review, we're making sure that you meet those daily requirements, but we're also making sure that you meet those weekly requirements as well. Now, remember, this is for lunch, and this does apply to all of your entree options. So that Uncrustable peanut butter and jelly, like Sean said, that only credits for 1 meat alternate and 1 grain. That would not get you to your 8 ounce weekly equivalent if it only credits for 1 grain. You would need to offer another grain with it. Next slide. The type of grain product you offer is also important. If you've been around the program for a while, you may remember that it's kind of been a roller coaster the past few years of the amount of items you had to offer as being whole grain rich. At one point, it was 50% of the items had to be whole grain rich. And then we went to 100% whole grain rich, and we had waivers, but we no longer have any waivers for whole grain rich items. And now, because of the transitional standards, at least 80% of the grain items you offer at both breakfast and lunch weekly must be whole grain rich, or they can also be 100% whole grain. And then the remaining 20% of the grain items you offer must be enriched. Of course, you can offer 100% of your grain items over the course of the week being whole grain rich. 80% is just the minimum that you have to meet for the week. So at least 80% of the grain items you offer over the course of the week must be whole grain rich. And what do we mean by whole grain rich? What's the definition of whole grain rich? Well, the USDA's definition of whole grain rich is it means that 50% of the grains in the product must be composed of whole grains by weight. And that word whole is important. So we're looking for whole grains. And then the remaining grain ingredients in the product must be enriched. So any item that contains 50% or more whole grains will meet this requirement. Of course, items that are 100% whole grain would also meet this requirement. Next slide. So how do you know if your product is whole grain rich? Well, there's 3 criteria to meet the definition of whole grain rich. The first one is the product contains at least 50% whole grains by weight. And this means that a whole grain is the first ingredient on your ingredient statement, or if water is the first ingredient, then the second ingredient must be a whole grain. And once again, when we're looking at our ingredient statement, we're looking for the word whole. Any remaining ingredients in that product must be enriched. So any remaining grain ingredients in that product must be enriched. And any non-credible grain ingredients must make up 2% or less of the product formula. Next slide. So documentation is required to demonstrate that you are in compliance with meeting that 80% whole grain rich requirement. And here are some examples of documentation. We'll go through these quickly as we'll be discussing and showing some examples coming up here in the presentation. So the product ingredient list is a good place to start. The first ingredient must be whole grain, or if the first ingredient is water, then the second ingredient must be whole grain, and then the remaining grains must be enriched. Second, a child nutrition label provides meal pattern contribution information for commercially prepared combination food items containing grains. And if the product does not have a CN label, then you can request a product formulation statement from your manufacturer to show that the item is whole grain rich. Recipes are documentation that the grains included in the recipe must indicate that 50% or more of the grain in that recipe is a whole grain. And the product can include the USDA approved whole grain health claim on its packaging. Or the product contains at least 8 grams of whole grain per ounce equivalent. So those are some ways to determine if your product is whole grain rich. Next slide. This slide shows an example of a product ingredient label. So you can see here the list of ingredients. The first ingredient says whole wheat flour. So it has that word whole that we're looking for. Whole grain is our number 1 ingredient. So this product would be whole grain rich. You can see that our enriched wheat flour is the second ingredient. So the remaining grain products are enriched. So this would meet the definition of being a whole grain rich product. Next slide. The next example is a child nutrition or CN label. And a child nutrition label provides meal pattern contribution information for commercially prepared or combination food items containing grains. So we can see in this example, each 4.5 ounce chicken stir fry bowl provides a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Next slide. If the product does not have a CN label, you may request a product formulation statement from the manufacturer. And the product formulation statements are developed by manufacturers to provide specific information about their products. They generally include a detailed explanation of what the product contains and the amount of each ingredient in the product by weight. These statements should be written on the manufacturer's letterhead and include the name of the product and product code number, the crediting statement, and signed and dated by an official of the manufacturer. So in this one, you can see under Roman numeral I, it says, does this product meet the whole grain rich criteria? And under the description of our creditable grain ingredient, we can see that whole wheat flour is 30% of the flour by weight, and the enriched flour is 22%. So over 50% of the grain products are whole grain rich. So this meets the definition of a whole grain rich product. At the bottom, it tells us that the total contribution for this product is 1.75 ounce equivalents of grains. Next slide. School recipes are also documentation that items are whole grain rich. So at least 50% or more of the grain is whole grain. We can see in this cornbread school recipe that the total amount of grains equals 2.5 pounds. Our whole wheat flour is a half a pound, and our whole grain cornmeal is 1 pound. So if we take 1.5 pounds divided by 2.5 pounds of the total grains in our product, that equals 60%. So by weight in this recipe, 60% of our grain is whole grain. So this would meet the definition of being a whole grain rich recipe. Next slide. The product may also contain the FDA health claim. So it says diets rich in whole grain foods and other plant foods and low in total fat, saturated fat, and cholesterol may reduce the risk of heart disease and some cancers. And there's also a second health claim listed there. The whole grain stamp on the right shows if it has 8 grams or more per serving, then that product would be whole grain rich. If the product contains 16 grams or more per serving, then that product would be 100% whole grain, and either of those would qualify for being a whole grain rich product. Next slide. A total of 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts may be offered per week and credited towards your meal pattern. Now, just keep in mind when offering grain-based desserts that the nutrition standards must be considered when planning these menu items. And Allie will be talking about these coming up. So your calories, your fat, your saturated fat, those all need to be kept in mind when you're planning desserts, but they can fit into a menu, and you can credit a total of 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich desserts per week. Next slide. The next slide talks about how to determine if at least 80% of the grains you served are whole grain rich. So remember that you can continue to offer all 5 days whole grain as being whole grain rich products. If you want to use the 80% transitional standards, one option for lunch would be to offer 4 days of whole grain rich products and then leaving 1 day as just an enriched grain product. So we can see Monday they offered 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich, Tuesday, 2-ounce equivalents of whole grain rich products, Wednesday, 2-ounce equivalents, and Thursday, 2-ounce equivalents, for a total of 8-ounce equivalents of whole grain rich products over the course of the week. And then on Friday, they just offered an enriched grain product that was not whole grain rich. So a 2-ounce equivalent of an enriched grain product. So for the whole week, they had 10-ounce equivalents of all grains offered for the week. 8 divided by 10 would get you to your 80% of those products being whole grain rich for the course of the week. So that's one option, is to save one day for a non-whole grain rich item. On the next slide, it shows you another option. So option 2 would be to offer small amounts of enriched grains throughout the week, but still meeting that 80% requirement. So on Monday, they offered all whole grain rich products. Tuesday, they offered a 1-ounce equivalent of a whole grain rich product and a 1-ounce equivalent of an enriched grain product. Wednesday, 2 ounces of whole grain rich. Thursday, once again, they offered a 1-ounce equivalent of a whole grain rich product and a 1-ounce equivalent of an enriched product. And then Friday, 2-ounce equivalents of a whole grain rich product. So same math as before, your 8-ounce equivalents of whole grain rich products divided by 10-ounce equivalents of all the grains you offered throughout the course of the week would get you to that 80%. So meeting that 80% transitional standard for grain rich products offered throughout the course of the week. Now, once again, you can continue to offer all of your products as being whole grain rich throughout the course of the week. I think that's what we've continued to see at most schools, is continuing to try to stay at offering almost all of your products whole grain rich. This just does give you a little bit of flexibility if there's a product that's not well accepted by students, or if there's a supply chain issue. You were planning to have a whole grain rich product, but something got substituted and now you have to serve an enriched grain product. This 80% gives you a little bit of flexibility for that. Next slide. So up next, we're going to talk about calculating grain servings. And since you have to meet those daily and weekly grain requirements, it is important to know how to determine how your grain item contributes to meal pattern. Next slide. So how do you calculate a grain serving? Well, the first thing you need to do is you must determine the weight of your product. And you can do that either from your package information, your recipe information, or you can weigh the item. You do need to have a food scale, and you can usually find those for pretty cheap online or through your vendors. And then refer to the USDA's grain breads chart, which is, we will go to the next slide to look at that. And this is the next handout in your handout packet. So I want you to pull out your grain breads chart in your handout packet. We are going to go through this and do some practice with this. So this chart is used to determine how a grain item contributes to meal pattern. The chart is divided into 9 different groups, groups A through I, listed down the left-hand column in that black box there. The grain item is listed in the middle column. And then in the right-hand column, you have your weight or your portion size in ounces or grams. And that's given for how much an item in that group must weigh to credit as either a 1-ounce equivalent, a 3/4 ounce equivalent, a 1/2 ounce equivalent, or a 1/4 ounce equivalent of grain servings. So we can see in group A that everything in group A, so the bread type coating, the breadsticks, chow mein noodles, all the way down through pretzels and stuffing, all of those items must weigh 0.8 ounces or 22 grams to credit as a 1-ounce equivalent of grains. Now, kind of go down your chart there, looking through group A, group B, group C. What do you notice as you go down the chart? as you go down the list, the food items need to weigh more to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. And that's because we're adding other ingredients besides grains or flour in these products. So look at plain cookies in group C. A plain cookie has to weigh 1.2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent, whereas a cookie with nuts, raisins, or chocolate chips is going to fall into group E on the back of your chart. And that needs to weigh at least 2.4 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So that cookie needs to weigh twice as much as just a plain cookie to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. Next, on the back of your chart, I want to draw your attention to group H. Group H is the pasta group, pasta and rice, and a half a cup of cooked rice or pasta equals a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So if this is your only grain for the day, remember grades 9 through 12 need that 2 ounce equivalent of grains. So you would need to serve them either a full 1 cup portion of rice or pasta to meet that 2 ounce minimum for the day. Or if you're only serving them a half a cup of rice or pasta, you would need to offer another grain item to meet that 2 ounce equivalent for grades 9 through 12. So a breadstick or something like that to go along with your pasta. And finally, I did want to point out on this chart, you must always round down to the nearest 4th serving. So for example, in group A, if your item weighs 0.7 ounces, you can only credit that for a 3/4 ounce equivalent. You can't round up to 1 ounce. You would need to round down to the nearest ounce equivalent there. Next slide. So looking at this example, this is an example of using your package information. We have 100% wheat sandwich buns, and I find those in group B. I see buns, hamburger, and hot dog buns. And my bun weighs 2 ounces or 57 grams. And I can see in group B, an item needs to weigh 1 ounce or 28 grams to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So since my product weighs twice that much, it's going to credit as a 2 ounce equivalent of grains. Next slide. If I don't have that information, I can calculate the grain servings using 2 basic methods. I can weigh the product and compare that to the weights on the grain breads chart, or I can weigh my product and do a little bit of math. Next slide. So here's the equation if you need to do a little bit of math, and that equation is the weight of your grain item divided by the weight equivalent to a 1 ounce serving from the appropriate grain group on your grain breads chart. That's going to equal the number of grain servings. And remember, you need to round down to the nearest fourth ounce equivalent. So the weight of your grain item divided by the weight equivalent to 1 serving is going to equal your number of grain servings. So let's do an example here. Next slide. In our example, we have a homemade cinnamon roll, and our homemade cinnamon roll weighs 2.5 ounces. So let's find cinnamon rolls on our grain breads chart. And I see sweet rolls unfrosted in group D on the grain breads chart. And using the equation we just learned, my item weighs 2.5 ounces. And in group D, an item needs to weigh 2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So the weight of my item, 2.5 ounces, divided by the weight needed to equal a 1 ounce equivalent, which in group D is 2 ounces, is going to give us 1.25. So we would then round down to our nearest 4th grain serving, and it's already at a 4th grain serving. So our 2.5 ounce cinnamon roll is going to credit as a 1 1/4 ounce equivalent of grains. Next slide. So let's practice that just a little bit more here. And we'll go through these together. So first, let's find tortilla chips on your grain breads chart. And I see tortilla chips in group B. And for an item in group B to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent, it needs to weigh 1 ounce. And my portion size is 2 ounces. So I would take 2, the weight of my item, divided by 1, which is the weight equivalent to 1 grain serving in group B. So 2 divided by 1 is going to give me 2 ounce equivalents of whole grain rich products. Next, let's look at a blueberry muffin in group D. I find it blueberry muffin in group D, and in group D, a product must weigh 2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So my item weighs 1.5. I take 1.5 divided by 2, and that's going to give me 0.75 ounce equivalents of grains. So 1.5 divided by 2 will give me 0.75 ounce equivalents. Next, we have a snickerdoodle cookie, and I find plain cookies in group C. And in group C, an item must weigh 1.2 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So I take the weight of my item, which is 1 ounce, divided by 1.2 ounces, and that's going to give me 0.833. Now remember, I can't round up, so I'm going to need to round down. So my 1 ounce snickerdoodle cookie is going to credit as 0.75 ounce equivalents of grains. Next up, we have our pasta that we talked about. Pasta is in group H of your grain breads chart. And in group H, you need to serve a 1/2 cup portion to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. My portion size is 1 cup. So I take 1 cup divided by a 1/2 cup, and that's going to give me 2 ounce equivalents. So my 1 cup of cooked pasta is going to credit as 2 ounce equivalents of grains. And finally, our last example here is group E. We have a chocolate chip granola bar in group E. And in group E, those items need to weigh 2.4 ounces to credit as a 1 ounce equivalent. So my granola bar weighs 1 ounce. So I'm going to take 1 ounce divided by 2.4 ounces, and that's going to give me 0.416. Now remember, I can't round up. I can't round up to a 1/2. So I'm going to have to round down to a 1/4 or 0.25. So my 1 ounce granola bar is going to credit as a 1/4 ounce equivalent of grains. And you can click through those, Allie, and I think that'll give them their answers there. Okay, good job on that activity. Next up, we are going to move on to the milk component. So for milk, the minimum daily requirement is 8 fluid ounces for all grades. Grades K through 12 all need 8 fluid ounces of milk per day. It must be fluid milk. Dried milk is not allowed, and it must also be served as a beverage. So what this means is you can't put milk in pudding or something like that and have it count towards your only milk requirement for that day. Schools must offer at least 2 choices of milk. You can offer unflavored milk in either skim or low-fat 1%. And with the transitional standards, you can also offer flavored milk in either skim or low-fat 1% milk. Typically, I see schools offering let's say 1% white milk and skim chocolate milk, that would be at least 2 different choices. You can offer more, of course. So you could offer skim and low-fat 1% unflavored milk and skim chocolate and skim strawberry milk. So you could offer more than 2 choices, but you have to offer at least 2 choices. And no other beverage, so juice or water, cannot be promoted as an alternate to milk, and you cannot serve those in place of milk. Next slide. Schools may offer a non-dairy beverage that meets the USDA criteria. And in your handout packet, we have some approved varieties listed. If a substitution is offered, it must have the same nutritional content as cow's milk. So that's why we have this handout with the approved varieties, because in order for it to be approved, it has to have at least 276 milligrams of calcium, at least 8 grams of protein, and a certain amount of vitamin A, D, magnesium, phosphorus, potassium, riboflavin, and B12. So it has to at least meet those minimums to be nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk. And one thing I wanted to point out here is almond milk is not on here. It's not nutritionally equivalent to cow's milk. So there's several soy milk varieties. And then there's also this Ripple pea milk, which is a non-soy dairy-free variety as well that you could offer. Next slide. Another requirement is the water requirement. So drinking water must be available to students at no charge where meals are served. So this includes breakfast, lunch, and after-school snack if you operate that program. Cups are required to be available. So it's not sufficient just to have a water fountain or a drinking fountain in your cafeteria. You would need to also offer cups for kids, either at the point of service or somewhere where it's easily accessible for them to get a cup. A water fountain's one option. We also see pitchers or water dispensers. There's a lot of different ways to implement it. Remember, it can't be promoted as an alternate to milk, but you do have to offer it and have it available to students. Next slide. And we've talked a little bit about non-creditable menu items, but the next handout in your handout packet is your non-creditable and non-creditable food menu items. These can be served to add variety and improve acceptability, but you do want to consider the quantity and frequency of offering these products. So they do increase food cost, and they also contribute to those nutrient standards, which we'll be talking about. Some examples of these would be condiments, non-grain chips, bacon, pudding, and gelatin. And when you're thinking about these, you just want to think about how often you're offering these, occasionally, or it may be acceptable, but you're probably not going to want to offer these things maybe every day, although in some instances they are needed. So for example, if you're having a hamburger and French fries, of course you're going to want ketchup as a condiment, or salad dressing for your tossed greens or your vegetables. But you just do want to keep in mind those nutrient standards and those food costs, and whether it's really reasonable or necessary. So the ketchup example, of course, that's reasonable, that's necessary as a condiment to go with your foods. But is putting pudding and gelatin out on your fruit and vegetable bar every day, is that necessary? Probably not, because that does not contribute to meal pattern. So not something you would probably want to do on a regular basis with those. Okay, next slide. Up next, we're going to talk about how to credit combination foods, and the examples we're going to be looking at are cheeseburger on a bun, homemade lasagna, and taco salad. And to do that, we are going to use some of our Zoom features. So If you want to participate, you can, one option is to do a nonverbal reaction. So on my Zoom screen down at the bottom, my reactions are at the bottom, and it shows that little smiley face guy with a plus. If you click on that, then you can either give like a thumbs up or a heart if you agree, or an X if you don't agree. Or you can do an annotate. I kind of like this one, an annotate option. On my Zoom screen, it is up in the top. At the top, I see view options. And if I click on that little caret, there's a drop down. And then from that drop down, I can click annotate. And when I click annotate, there's different options. You can do text or draw or stamp. I like stamp, that check mark that says stamp. And you can put a check mark or a heart or a star. And I'll show you what we're going to do with those here on the next slide. So you can give me a nonverbal reaction, or you can annotate directly on your screen on the slide, and we'll be able to clear those once we get done with the example. So let's try this first example. So we have a cheeseburger with a bun. It's kind of a no-brainer, but given either a nonverbal reaction or using your annotate stamp function, give me, a heart or a star or a check mark or something if you think that a cheeseburger credits with a meat alternate. Okay, good. I see some people going. You can go ahead and do it for the rest: fruits, vegetables, grains, and milk. Which components do you think a cheeseburger with a bun credit for? Give you just a few more seconds here. I see lots of people adding their stars, hearts, and checks into our food components. If you accidentally check somewhere, that's okay. Okay, let's go ahead. Let's click through these here. So for meat alternate, we can clear those annotations. And for meat alternate, yes, it's going to credit. It has meat and cheese. So it's going to credit for meat alternate. Fruits, it's not going to credit for any fruits. Vegetables, no, our cheeseburger and a bun does not have any vegetables. Grains, yes, we have a whole grain rich bun, so it'll credit for the grain component. And milk, no, it's not going to credit for the milk component. I did see, a couple checks there. Now remember, cheese goes under meat alternate, not under milk. Okay, next example. Go ahead and annotate away on this one. So we have homemade lasagna. Is it going to credit for meat alternate component? Will it credit for the fruit component? Will it credit for vegetables? Will it credit for grains? And will it credit for milk? Great, thank you for participating. All right, let's go ahead and click through these. For meat alternate, yes, our homemade lasagna is going to credit for meat alternate. For meat and cheese, it's probably going to have some meat and cheese in there. It'll credit for meat alternate. Fruits, no, it's probably not going to credit for a fruit. Vegetables, maybe. It depends on the sauce you use. So if it has a CN label and it says that your commercial pasta sauce credits, then, or if it's commodity pasta sauce, it may credit, or if you've made your own, it may credit. If it's just a commercial sauce and you don't have any crediting information for it, then it's not going to credit for that vegetable component. Grains, yes, it's our whole grain rich lasagna noodles will credit for our grain component. And milk, no, we don't have any milk component just in this combination homemade lasagna food. Okay, and the last one of these is our taco salad. Go ahead and annotate away or use your nonverbal reactions for meat alternate, fruits, vegetables, grains, and milk. Awesome. I'm seeing lots of annotations and all of the right components here. And it's okay if you can't get your annotation to work or your nonverbal reactions, that's fine. I'm sorry about that, but if you can't get them to work, it's okay. Okay, let's go ahead, and those look correct. So meat alternate, yes, we have our taco meat and cheese that will credit for meat alternate. Fruits, no fruits on our taco salad. Vegetables, yes, we have lettuce, maybe beans. I can't really tell from here. Now remember what Sean talked about with the beans. Those can only credit for either the vegetable component or the meat alternate component. You wouldn't be able to credit those for both. Grains, we have our whole grain rich tortilla chips, so we can credit grains with those. And then milk, no, we have no fluid milk here, so we're not going to credit the milk component with our taco salad. Good. Okay, next we're going to keep testing your knowledge of those meal pattern requirements. So keep going with your annotate option or your nonverbal reactions. So just a reminder, those are found at the bottom or at the top of your screen. The first one, now when we're looking at these examples, hang on just a minute before you answer these. So when we're looking at these examples, we are looking at these as the meal, as the menu, the meal planner, not what the student is coming through the point of service with their tray with. Okay, so we're going to do two different ones. The first one is whether this meal meets meal pattern requirements for grades K through 8. And then we're going to clear it and say whether it meets meal pattern for grades 9 through 12. So our first tray is a whole grain rich corn dog with that credits for a 2-ounce equivalent of grains and 2 ounces of meat alternate, a half a cup of French fries, a half a cup of corn, a half a cup of peaches, and 1 cup of milk. So for grades K through 8, does this credit for, does this meet meal pattern? If you've planned this meal, does this meet meal pattern for grades K through 8? And go ahead and do your nonverbal reactions or annotate in that yes or no box whether you think this meets meal patterns for grades K through 8. I'm seeing lots of yeses. Okay, I think we've got most of them here. So yes, I agree. For grades K through 8, this meets meal pattern. It has our minimum amount of grains, meat, fruit, vegetable, and milk. So it meets meal pattern. Now, if we can clear those annotations. And what about for grades 9 through 12? Does this meet meal pattern for grades 9 through 12? Okay, we're getting lots of no's. And I agree with everybody who's putting no. So for we have enough grain and we have enough meat. We have enough vegetable. We have a full cup of vegetable, half a cup of French fries and a half a cup of corn would give us 1 cup of vegetable. But peaches, we only have a half a cup of peaches. So we are short on that fruit component. If we're planning our menu for the day, we need to plan for grades 9 through 12. We need to offer them at least 1 cup of fruit for that day, for that meal. So good. Okay, next one, same thing. For grades K through 8, that'll be your first one to mark yes or no. We have chicken nuggets. Our 4 chicken nuggets, we're going to say credit for 2 ounce equivalents of grains and 2 ounce equivalents of meat alternate. We have a 1 ounce equivalent slice of whole grain rich bread. We have a half a cup of creamy whipped potatoes, a 1/4 a cup of mixed vegetables, a chocolate chip cookie, which is a 1/2 ounce equivalent of grains, and 1 cup of milk. So for grades K through 8, does this meet meal pattern? Now, this is what you've planned as the meal planner, not what they're coming through the point of service with. Have you planned all 5 components in the required portion sizes for grades K through 8? All right,
No.
we have some mixed reactions here. A little bit. The majority are saying no, and I agree. If you're saying no, what are we missing? We're missing a fruit, right? We're missing a whole component. We're missing the fruit component. Even though we planned all this food, we're missing a component. So this would not meet meal pattern that you've planned all 5 components in the required portion sizes for grades K through 8. So let's go ahead and clear it. And of course, 9 through 12, is this going to meet meal pattern for grades 9 through 12? All right, now everybody's got no on this one. And of course, we're still missing the fruit component for grades 9 through 12. But what else do you notice here? Our vegetable, we're also short on vegetable because we've only planned a half a cup of potatoes and a 1/4 a cup of mixed vegetables. For grades 9 through 12, you need to plan 1 cup of vegetables for grades 9 through 12. So you would be short on the vegetable component as well, and also missing a fruit component for grades 9 through 12. All right, good job. Next one. All right, our next one. So for grades K through 8, have you planned all 5 components in the required portion size? For grades K through 8, we have nachos with meat cheese. We have 1 serving is going to be equivalent to a 1 ounce equivalent of grains and 2 ounce equivalents of meat alternate, a half a cup of corn, a half a cup of black beans, 1 apple, and 1 cup of milk. Good. I think for those who are participating, most of us have marked yes for grades K through 8. And I agree, we have the minimum daily amount of grains is 1 ounce equivalent for grades K through 8. We have our minimum amount of meat, 1 cup of vegetables, our apple, and our milk. So this meets meal pattern for grades K through 8. And then let's clear it. And what about for grades 9 through 12? Does this meet meal pattern for 9 through 12? Good. I see most of us have marked no. So for grades 9 through 12, we're short on our grain component, right? Grades 9 through 12 need to be offered a minimum of 2 ounces equivalents of grains daily. So here we only have a 1 ounce equivalent of grains. So we're short on the grain component for grades 9 through 12. And I see a question, you're right, this does not include a fruit or vegetable bar. So if you have a fruit or vegetable bar, then of course that would meet the requirements. But this is just what we were planning if we were just, planning a menu for the day in the minimum portion sizes. So just checking your knowledge of the minimum portion sizes. Okay, let's go ahead and go to the next one. And our last one here is we're going on a field trip, and in the sack lunch, we've packed a deli sandwich, baked chips, baby carrots, a fruit strip, and milk. So does this meet the meal pattern requirements for grades K through 8 or 9 through 12? Not seen any more annotations come up there, and I agree, no, it does not meet the meal pattern for grades K through 8 or for 9 through 12, because on field trips, there's no offer versus serve. So you have to send all 5 components in their full portion sizes. So here we're missing a fruit. Fruit strips don't credit for fruit. And for our vegetable for grades K through 8, you would need to send at least 3/4 cup of vegetable and a 1/2 cup of fruit. And for grades 9 through 12, you would need to send a full cup of vegetable and a full cup of fruit in your sack lunch, because you have to send all components in their required portion sizes. The other point that I want to make here is you also need to send milk. So you do need to send milk in coolers or something like that. Sometimes we see that as a mistake. You can't, send juice or bottles of water in place of the milk. If you're crediting these field trip meals, you need to have all components in the required portion sizes. All right, well, thank you for participating and doing your annotations and your nonverbal reactions. That was fun. Up next, we're going to move to the breakfast meal pattern, and Allie is going to take over presenting for school breakfast meal pattern.
Like I said, now we're going to talk about the school breakfast meal pattern. And in your handouts, you'll find the full chart of the breakfast meal pattern requirements. It's also available on our website if you need another copy. If you're new to breakfast planning meals, we recommend you print this chart and read through it. And similar to lunch, you can see the different grade groups with daily and weekly requirements. Also, as you look at the components, you see only 3 are required at breakfast, and those 3 are fruit, grains, and milk. So as we talk through the slides and each component in detail, you can reference this chart. As I mentioned, breakfast consists of 3 required components. Those 3 required components are grains with a minimum of 1 ounce per day with additional weekly requirements, and fruit offered at 1 cup per day, and milk 8 fluid ounces. At a minimum, 3 components must be offered, but more can be served. And just like lunch, there are required grade groups and there is overlap, so a single menu can be used for all grade groups at breakfast. For example, on grains, like I mentioned, besides the daily minimum, there is a weekly requirement for each grade group. So to plan a K through 12 menu, you would plan for a minimum of 9 grains for the week. So to keep it simple, if you planned for 2 grains daily, you will be compliant for all grades. We're going to review some breakfast terminology because it's a little different than lunch before we get into each component. So breakfast menus are based on required meal components, but recognized as food items on the tray when determining a reimbursable breakfast. Again, a food component is one of the 3 required food groups. Those were grains, fruit, and milk. At breakfast, a food item is a specific food offered with one of the 3 food components. So an example we like to give is you may offer 4 ounces of juice and half a cup of pears. These are the same fruit component, but they are recognized as 2 different food items on the tray. You need to keep that in mind as we go forward with the examples. So what makes up a breakfast menu? When planning your menu, you must offer all 3 required food components. In order to have offer versus serve at breakfast, the menu planner must also offer 4 food items. So it's important for your cashier to recognize a reimbursable meal, and they need to be trained for breakfast and lunch. This may require you to explain how items count towards food items at breakfast. For a breakfast to be reimbursable, at least 4 food items must be offered. Students must select 3 food items, including half a cup of fruit and or vegetable for the meal to be reimbursable under offer versus serve. So let's use this checklist to determine if breakfasts are reimbursable under offer versus serve. So here's some questions you can ask. Does the meal offered consist of at least 4 food items? Does the meal offered include the minimum required amounts of fruits, grain, and milk? And does the meal selected by the student contain at least 3 food items, including at least half a cup of fruit and or vegetable? If the answer to each of these questions is yes, the breakfast meal is reimbursable under offer versus serve. So now we're going to talk about the components and food items, and we're going to talk about each one specifically. So first, we're going to look at the grains at breakfast. So at breakfast, you can serve a double portion of the same grain item, and it counts as 2 food items. So in our example here, I could serve 2 pieces of toast to count as 2 grain servings, or 2 food items for the day. Or I could serve 1 large bagel that credits as 2 grains, and this would be considered 2 food items. As I mentioned, and also you can see in your handout, you'll notice that there is no requirement to offer a separate meat alternate. But if you choose to offer menu items that contain meat alternate, they must be served with a grain. The meat alternate is known as a grain substitute when counting your grains for the weekly requirement. You do not include the meat alternate when calculating out the whole grain rich percentages. The menu planner can plan to serve a meat alternate such as eggs, sausage, or yogurt, but it must be served along with a grain item. The meat alternate cannot be by itself without a grain component. You can serve the meat alternate as an extra and not count it towards a grain. So let's look at some examples paired together and see how they credit. So for example, a 1 ounce grain equivalent, let's say it's cereal, and a 1 ounce meat alternate of yogurt credits as 2 grains for the day. Or maybe you're serving a breakfast sandwich. The grain is a bagel that credits as 1.5 ounce grain equivalent, and you have a turkey sausage that is 0.5 ounces of meat alternate. So the 1.5 ounce grain and the 0.5 ounce meat alternate credit towards 2 grains for the day. And in our last example, you could serve a 2 ounce grain, let's say it's a waffle, and no meat alternate, and this also credits as 2 grains for the day. Remember, when planning breakfast, you do have to count all items toward nutrient standards. So you'll want to watch the frequency of serving meat alternates like meats and cheeses and eggs at breakfast to ensure you're not going over limits for calories, sodium, and fat. When we look at the fruit component, you can serve fruit juices. They must be 100% fruit juice, and no more than half of the fruit offered during the week can be from fruit juice. So this is easy when you're planning your menu. if you plan for 1/2 cup of fruit juice and 1/2 cup of fruit each day, you're covering the 1 cup requirement to offer, and no more than half of your offering per week is fruit juice. Frozen varieties should not contain added sugar. So again, for example, if you're serving frozen strawberries, be sure to check the ingredient label to make sure it only contains strawberries and not strawberries and added sugar. Canned fruit should be packed in its own juice or can be packed in light syrup. And remember, the daily requirement for fruit offered is 1 cup. To help reduce plate waste, we recommend offering a variety of fruits and juices daily. Plan for 1/2 cup portions, at least 2 different choices each day. And for a reimbursable breakfast to be claimed, the student must have 1/2 cup of fruit on their tray. A menu planner, you must allow students to take the full cup of fruit if they want it. If you plan for 1/2 cup of juice and 1/2 cup of strawberries that day, remember they can take both items, but in this example, it would be up to you whether you allow them to take 2 juice boxes. Again, keep in mind that no more than half of the fruit or vegetable offerings during the week may be in the form of the juice. You can use signage to help the students understand what is being offered as part of the reimbursable breakfast. As we move on to the vegetable component, again, as you look at your chart, you can see there are no requirements to serve vegetables at breakfast, but they can be offered if you want. One example of a choice that could contain vegetables could be a breakfast burrito and the commodity salsa. Those would have crediting vegetables. Again, it's not required to serve vegetables at breakfast, but is highly encouraged and is acceptable. Now we're going to talk a little bit about grains. You're required to meet the daily and weekly minimums for grains, but you can serve more at breakfast. And as you look at your chart, you can see the daily grades. The daily requirement for grades K through 12 is 1 ounce equivalent of grain. Moving on to milk, the milk components. The minimum daily requirement is 8 fluid ounces for all grades. Milk must be served as a beverage, as Erica mentioned. Schools must offer at least 2 choices. One offering must be unflavored milk, and it can be skim or 1%. And the other offering can be a flavored milk at skim or 1%. So as we wrap up reviewing the breakfast meal pattern, we review some important points. Portion size for fruit offered is 1 cup. And all grains offered must be whole grain rich. A reimbursable breakfast must contain at least 3 items and must have 1/2 cup of fruit or vegetable if you're substituting for a fruit. Now we're going to look at some breakfast choices. Again, you can use your annotate or your stamp annotate to select yes or no on the screen. So we're going to identify whether the breakfast meal pattern. Keep in mind, these are not meals that the student would necessarily take, but we're checking if meal pattern for breakfast has been met when planning the menu. So when you look at the screen, does this planned meal meet breakfast meal pattern requirements? We have 1 ounce equivalent of cereal, a 1 ounce equivalent grain for cereal, a 1 ounce equivalent grain for the graham cracker. We have 1/2 cup juice, and we have 1 cup of milk. So does the planned meal here meet the breakfast meal pattern requirement? So you can go ahead and put your annotations on there. I see a lot of you checking no. Let's give you a few moments here. So all of our answers are on no, which is great. This does not meet meal pattern requirements. And why not? You need to offer 1 cup of fruit, and we've only offered 1/2 cup of juice here. So great. Good job on that one. I'll clear this one, and we'll move on to the next one. So again, does this meet the planned meal pattern requirements? So we have 1 ounce equivalent of cereal. We have a 2 ounce meat alternate. It's an egg patty with cheese. We have half a cup of juice. It looks like a whole fresh orange and 1 cup of milk. Yes or no? Looks good. Most of you are clicking on yes. And I will agree with you on that one as well, that this does meet the breakfast meal pattern requirements for a planned meal. We have one more example, clear that. Again, does this meal meet breakfast meal pattern requirements? We have a 1 ounce equivalent grain, which is a waffle. We have a 1.5 ounce meat alternate of scrambled eggs, a 0.5 ounce meat alternate of a sausage patty, half a cup of juice, half a cup of strawberries, and 1 cup of milk. Most of you have clicked on yes, and again, I will agree with that. This offering would meet the breakfast meal pattern requirement. We have our full cup of fruit, we have our milk, and we have our grain offerings. And in this example, we've given some meat alternate examples as well. Very good. Good job on that one. I'm going to clear. And up next, we're going to talk about nutrient standards. So we'll shift gears a little bit and talk about that. In your packet, you have a handout as well for this. So if you want to pull that out next, it'll be after that breakfast meal pattern chart. The USDA has nutrient standards for breakfast and lunch that must be met as part of the meal pattern. There are weekly average requirements for calories, sodium, and saturated fat limits. In addition, there are daily requirements for no trans fat. These, again, are listed in the handout in your packet. It is called the USDA Nutrient Standards for Breakfast and Lunch. That's the name of the chart at the top. So you can look through this as I go through the slides. We're going to talk about each standard a little bit. As you can see, first on the chart are the calorie standards. There are minimum and maximum calorie levels identified for each grade group. Calorie values are averaged for the 5-day week, so something to remember when you're making those menu changes. Keep in mind that lunch values are separate from breakfast. And pay attention to condiment usage and those items, like Erica mentioned, that don't count towards meal pattern requirements. They're still going to add to the calories for the meal. So in February of 2022, the USDA announced the transitional meal standards in an effort to support school meal program operations. Due to specific implementation delays and challenges during the pandemic, some schools were not prepared to fully meet the standards for milk, whole grains, and sodium. So the transitional standards were put in place. So as of last school year, which was school year 22-23, you were already offering the low-fat flavored milk, if you could source it, and an unflavored milk offering at breakfast and lunch. You were also offering grains at 80% whole grain rich, and the sodium levels were at target 1. So new for this year is lunch only moves to target 1A. And this has a 10% reduction in the sodium standards. Again, the sodium reduction is only for lunch this year, and breakfast remains at target 1. So let's look at the next slide to see the sodium standards from your chart. This slide is also in your handouts and further explains the transitional sodium limits for the National School Lunch Program and the School Breakfast Program. So as you can see on the slide, breakfast remains at that target 1 level for all grade groups, and lunch has moved to target 1A with a 10% reduction in sodium levels. So you might be asking yourself, how can we lower our sodium in the foods we serve to children? We have some suggestions. So as we move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about things to consider when purchasing to meet those new sodium targets. Consider low sodium products. You can always ask your sales rep for low sodium gravy mixes, cheese sauce mixes, low sodium broths and soups. Also consider your instant mashed potatoes as they often carry a sodium load. And consider low sodium canned vegetables such as low sodium green beans and other canned vegetables. You can ask your sales rep for samples to try and consider before you order a whole case. Another area to consider, and we've mentioned a lot today, is your condiment usage. Think about things like ketchup and salad dressings. If you have a lower sodium option, or consider making your own dressings from a recipe. As you can see on the slide, another option could be offering up a flavor station. So you could purchase salt-free seasonings. There's a variety of different brands out there, or you could make your own and set up a station to add flavor to the food without adding additional sodium. Consider fresh ingredients to add flavor, like a topping bar. So this you could do on a nacho day, and maybe a lot of you already do this. You could have a baked potato bar or a sub sandwich bar, a burger bar. And on the condiment bar or the topping bar, which you could offer is fresh tomatoes or green onions. You could offer fresh peppers, a variety of herbs, maybe something that's locally grown in your school garden. Anything fresh that's going to add flavor without adding additional sodium because it's not a processed item. You could make a fresh corn salsa or a pico de gallo on a nacho day. Just try to use fresh ingredients and incorporate more scratch cooking if possible. The less processed foods you purchase, the better control you'll have over the added sodium. And these are all very small steps that you can start taking to hopefully add quality ingredients and less sodium items in your program. Let's move on. And as we move on in the nutrient standards chart, we see that meals cannot contain added trans fat, and no more than 10% of the calories can come from saturated fat. So saturated fat most frequently comes from animal products, cheeses, butters, the fat or skin of a meat, like a chicken leg or something similar, and then solid shortenings. So watch the frequency of those items. Also, fat-free and low-fat milk has helped the industry meet these guidelines. So consider that when you're in meal planning. And a quick review of the standards before we wrap up and move on. Be sure to follow the meal pattern component requirements and portion sizes for each grade group, and you'll likely stay within ranges of nutrient standards. Be aware of those extra items that do not meet meal pattern requirements, but still add to the nutrient standards. Some of you may use a USDA approved software for nutrient analysis, which is a great tool, but it is not required. As part of the administrative review process, a series of questions called the dietary specification tool will need to be answered to determine whether a nutrient analysis is required or not. Remember, meals served over a 5-day week must meet specific nutrient and calorie standards. And items that are high in calories, fat, and sodium must be limited to ensure compliance with nutrient standards. And lastly, ensure your menus are supported by documentation of the product's nutritional value. And the documentation is provided through nutrition fact labels, product specification labels, and standardized recipes. All right, up next, we have offer versus serve, identifying a recent reimbursable meal, and point of meal service counting.
Okay, thank you, Allie. Let's move on to the last section of our presentation today. And as Allie said, we're going to be talking about the 3 topics on the slide. And we will move on into the next slide, which is identifying a reimbursable meal. Signage must be displayed at or near the beginning of the serving line. And that's a requirement from USDA. Students need to be able to identify all of the food components before going through the serving line. And so we have some great new signage that's available to you, or you can create your own. I like the picture of the tray that identifies what the food components are and their location on the tray. But as I mentioned, we have some new signage that's available from our office, and you can order that. There's some information. Let's move on to the next slide. I think we'll get to that. Don't forget breakfast signage as well, because you have to have it for both breakfast and lunch. And so we have the top poster available for you. These are some really nice posters that were created by USDA, and they're available for you to order if you actually want the big poster size from the Team Nutrition website. And we have made those posters smaller so that we can mail them to you. Now, the example over in the right-hand corner is just a menu board, which identifies, what the components are for breakfast. And it's something that a school created. You just need to have signage available for both breakfast and lunch. Let's move to the next slide. So this is where you can order the material from. It's on our homepage of the Nutrition Services website, and it's under the material order form where you can mark what signage you need and it will be sent to you. So keep that in mind as we start the next school year. Take a look at your signage that's posted, and do you need to order new signage? Does it look attractive? Did it disappear over the summer? Often those things happen, and so make sure you have your signage. We also have the non-discrimination poster and Justice for All poster available. So we do not have the newest version of the and Justice for All poster, but we do have the older version available to send out. Next slide. And I had mentioned you can order the poster size of the signage, which is really nice. And it's under the Team Nutrition Resources for Schools. And that's a hyperlink that is in the slide deck that you can order. And if you go to Offer versus Serve materials, then that's where you can order the posters. There's also a lot of nice resources available under Team Nutrition. So when you're on the site, take a look at all the great items they have available. And those are shipped to you free of charge. You just need to order them. So about any resource that is out there is available to you for free. Next slide. So let's move into Offer versus Serve. Offer versus Serve is a serving option that's available to schools. And the purpose of Offer versus Serve is it allows students to decline food items. The goal of Offer versus Serve is, of course, to minimize plate waste. We don't want students taking food that they do not intend on eating. It encourages schools to offer choices, like we talked about our fruit and vegetable bars. When there's more choices, certainly a student can find something from a fruit vegetable bar that they will eat. The same thing with offering entree choices. So it encourages choices in schools. And we all know that if we have choices, it's going to improve customer satisfaction. So there's a handout in your packet that explains offer versus serve. So let's move to the next slide and we will go through an explanation of it as well. All required food components must be offered in the full portion size. So you still have to plan your menus with all of the food components in the required portion size. And the meal must be priced as a unit. So it doesn't matter if the student takes all 5 components for lunch, or if they take 4 components, food components at lunch, or 3 components at lunch. It's all priced the same. The student decides which items to decline, and that's important to really stress. It's the student's decision which food components that they take. A school cannot require a student to take an entree and or milk. So they can turn, with offer versus serve, they can turn down their milk and they can turn down the entree. They still have to have the required food components on their tray, but you can't dictate what a student takes. And it really, the purpose isn't to slow down the line with asking the student, do you want, this, this, and this? The signage tells the student what the food components are. They know the menu, and then it's their responsibility to tell you in the serving line if they don't want something. So we don't want it to slow down meal service, but we do want to give the student the choice of turning down something they don't intend on eating. Let's move to the next slide. So the student must select at lunch 3 different food components. And of those 3 different food components, one must be at least a half a cup of fruit, vegetable, or a combination of the 2. So for example, a student can leave the line with the cheeseburger on the bun and a half a cup of applesauce, and that is a reimbursable meal because I have my grain component, I have my meat alternate, and they've taken at least a half a cup of applesauce to count as my half cup of fruit, vegetable, or a combination of the 2. So it's that easy to get a reimbursable meal at lunch. A reimbursable breakfast must contain at least 3 food items. So I'm not talking components, I'm talking food items. And so one of those must be at least a half a cup of fruit or veggie if substituting. So for example, at breakfast, they could take cereal, toast, and then a half a cup of juice, and that's a reimbursable breakfast. They could take cereal, milk, and an apple, and that would be a reimbursable meal at breakfast. Let's move on to the next slide. Students must be charged the full price for the meal, whether it contains 3, 4, or all 5 components. And the cashier, your point of service person, must be able to recognize a reimbursable meal. So they're the person that identifies that the student is present and that they have the reimbursable meal. So they're looking for, does the student have at least 3 components on their tray at lunch? And one of those is at least a half a cup of fruit or vegetable. And the same would apply at breakfast. They're looking for 3 items, and one of those has to be at least a half a cup of fruit or vegetable. So that cashier is pretty important, and they need to be positioned so that they can actually look at that tray to identify that student has a reimbursable meal. Now, if the student does not have 3 components, so for example, they get to the cashiering station and they don't have at least a half a cup a fruit or vegetable, then the cashier sends the student back and asks them to select more. But they still have to come back to the cashier so the cashier can look at the tray to make sure they have at least that half cup of fruit or vegetable. If the student refuses, the meal cannot be claimed for reimbursement, and the student must be charged a la carte pricing for the food items taken. So if you have a student that says, nope, I'm not going back, then you have to be able to charge them a la carte pricing. Now, some schools offer fresh fruit at the cashier station or the point of service station. So they have apples, oranges, bananas available at the cashier station. And then, you know, instead of sending the student back to the fruit and vegetable bar, they can be offered an apple, orange, or banana at the cashier station. They just have to take that food item and it has to be on their tray. They don't have to eat it after they leave the point of service or the cashier station, but they have to leave the line with at least that half a cup of fruit or vegetable on their tray. Next slide. So, offer versus serve at lunch. It's mandatory for high school students. Now, if you're in a situation, we have a lot of different types of sponsors that participate on our program, and we have some situations where the trays are served to our high school students. Perhaps maybe they're in some sort of juvenile justice facility that because the trays are served, then it would not be mandatory for high school students. But in our typical school districts, it's mandatory for high school. Offer versus serve is optional for all grades other than high school, but we encourage it. We don't want kids to throw food away that they have no intention on eating. So our office highly encourages offer versus serve. Students must select at a minimum at least a half a cup of fruit and or vegetable and may decline 2 other components. So I always tell the story of it's when I go to a school and I'm standing by the cashier and the cashier tells the student to go back and get a half a cup of fruit or vegetable or go get more. And the student says, well, I've never had to do that again or before. That's always kind of an indication that they are not monitoring those trays to ensure that that student has at least a half a cup of fruit or vegetable. So make sure your cashiers know how important they are, and they are really the person that's determining that the student is taking that reimbursable meal. Next slide. At breakfast, you're required to offer a minimum of the 3 required components like Allie talked about, but with offer versus serve, must offer 4 food items. Students may decline 1 item, but must take at a minimum a half a cup of fruit, juice, or vegetable. And I noticed in the chat, somebody asked about milk on cereal. Milk has to count as a component. It's the carton of milk or the 1 cup requirement. They can take that carton of milk and after they leave the line, but it has to be 1 cup, the portion size, and pour it on their cereal. But it is the required portion size of 1 cup. So at breakfast, offer versus serve is optional for all grade groups. But once again, we don't want kids to take items that they don't intend on eating. And so it's highly encouraged that you implement offer versus serve at breakfast. Next slide. Schools that do not implement offer versus serve, all students must leave the serving line with all food components in the required portion size. So if you don't implement offer versus serve at your school, then all trays have to look identical with the required portion size So for the grade group, let's take, for example, an elementary that's K through 8 that does not implement offer versus serve. We would expect to see the 3/4 cup requirement of vegetable and the 1/2 cup requirement of fruit, the grain requirement, the meat alternate, and milk on that tray. So highly encourage offer versus serve. Sometimes if for like our younger students, our kindergarten first graders, having that much food on their tray at 3/4 cup of vegetable and a 1/2 cup of fruit can be overwhelming. And sometimes when there's so much food on a tray, kids maybe won't eat as much, it's just so much. So really encourage offer versus serve for all grades. Next slide. Okay, we've already talked a little bit about the importance of your cashier, and we call that the point of service meal count. And it's defined as that point in the serving line where it can be accurately determined a reimbursable meal has been taken by the student. So that is after all food components have been offered to the student for their selection. And once again, I'm going to refer you back to the handout that talks about the importance of the point of service meal count. Next slide. Meal counts must be taken at the end of the serving line or at a location after all food components have been offered. And that includes after any fruit and veggie bar or food line. So it can't be done at the beginning of the line. It has to be done after all food components have been offered. Now, condiments aren't food components, so they can be away from the point of service meal count, but that point of service count has to be after your fruit and veggie bars because those are food components you're offering your students. It can't be, well, we're offering during the serving line our entree, our hot vegetable. They have 3 items before they leave that. Then they go to the fruit and vegetable bar. No, it has to be after all food components, including fruit and veggie bars. Next slide. So we have lots of resources on offer versus serve because cashiers need to be trained. We talk about this during our bookkeeping training as well. Oftentimes, individuals other than food service staff are conducting your point of service meal count, and they need to know that, yes, they have to implement offer versus serve correctly. They're in charge of identifying that reimbursable meal. There's a great manual from USDA on offer versus serve that explains offer versus serve, and it goes through a lot of different scenarios of offer versus serve. We have a handout that's included in your packet, a couple of handouts. We have 4 handouts in your packet on offer versus serve. So I would refer those to you for your training of your cashiers. Next slide. These are from USDA, and these are very nice as well on explaining offer versus serve for breakfast and lunch, and they're included in your handout packet. Offer versus serve is a great serving option, but that cashier is critical in identifying the reimbursable meal. So they can't be sitting at a lunch table watching students from a distance. They have to actually be looking at that tray to ensure that student has that reimbursable meal. Next slide. Okay, as we wrap up things, I know you're probably thinking to yourselves, oh my gosh, this is so much information. And we will be posting our part 1, 2, and 3 to our website later in August. But this is another great resource for you, the Institute of Child Nutrition. They have developed a back to school resource center for our school districts. the Institute for Child Nutrition is contracted, they have a contract with USDA to provide training. And this is something new that they have developed, and it's back to school, and it is a great resource for you to further your training on the school meals program. So our own chef, Sharon, who was the food service director at Gretna Public School, now works for the Institute of Child Nutrition. We can see her picture on the screen. And then as you click through, that's a hyperlink that will take you to the website. Next slide. They have 49 different areas where you can gain more information on the school meals program. So not only is this a nice resource for you to utilize further your training, but it's a great way to get your continuing education hours for professional standards. So lots of different topics, all important to know about. And so wanted to make sure that you're aware of this resource.